So in this last video for Chapter 11, we want to talk about two things. One is we want to talk about human capital. And human capital is really all of the education, experience, skills that the people in an economy have, right? And so if we think about, sort of basic levels of human capital, we think about literacy rates, numeracy rates, but then we think about more advanced levels of human capital. We think about the number of people who have graduated from high school, from college with advanced degrees, the number of engineers, all of these things will go into sort of the level of human capital. And we want to think about how do we think about human capital and growth, and does human capital cause technological growth? Is it a necessity for technological growth? And so we'll think about that a little bit. And then finally, we'll just look at the appendix briefly and talk a little bit more about sort of general Cobb-Douglas production functions and how our example was just one example of Cobb-Douglas production functions that can sort of take on a more nuanced view of the production function. So human capital is really important, right? So human capital, which we'll call H here, is the set of skills all of the workers have, right? So it's education, it's on-the-job training, it's everything that the workers have in their minds. And so we can add that as an input, sort of think about human capital per worker and physical capital per worker. And so now our production function would be y over n is a function of capital over labor and human capital over labor, right? So K now is just physical capital. They both increase output. And the idea here is that spending more on education, spending more on training will increase steady state levels of output per worker because it will increase the amount of human capital per worker. And so one of the sort of changes in economic growth theory, which sort of took place in the 1990s, were these models of endogenous growth. And the idea here is that we could have steady state growth in output per worker depending not only on the savings rate, but also the rate of spending on education. And so this says, the second bullet, however, the current consensus is that given the rate of technological progress, higher rates of saving or spending on education do not lead to a permanently higher growth rate, kind of assumes away the problem, right? Because sure, given the rate of technological progress, then maybe those things don't change it, but can we take the rate of technological progress as given and as somehow independent of human capital? And I would certainly argue no, right? That rate of technological progress has to depend on, the level of education that you have, how many engineers you have, the research and development that you have. And those are the things that we're going to talk about in Chapter 12. The first models of economic growth kind of assumed that it was something separate. And as we'll see, that's what we're going to look at. We're going to call it A. It's like, that's technology. And that sort of begs the question of, well, how does technology grow? And technology grows because firms and workers have an incentive to improve the level of technology, improve the way that we combine inputs into outputs. But they can't, that just doesn't come out of anywhere, right? They need to have the skills and experience in order to make those improvements. And that, if that's not human capital, then I don't know what it is. So I think that's important to remember. We'll come back to that in Chapter 12. Now, the appendix basically just gives us a more general form of the Cobb-Douglas production function. So in our example in Chapter 11, we had a Cobb-Douglas production function that was K to the alpha and N to the alpha. And alpha was 1/2 for both, right? Our more general is alpha, K to the alpha, where alpha is something less than 1, and then N to the 1 minus alpha. So as long as these two coefficients add up to 1, we have constant returns to scale. And this thought to be a good description of the relationship between physical capital, labor, and output when Messrs. Cobb and Douglas came up with this production function. So in our steady state, right, we know that savings per worker has to equal depreciation per worker. And if K star is our steady state level of capital, then we can solve for this for any given level of alpha, right? So here we have S times the production function, K over N to the alpha is equal to delta times K over N. And then if we solve that, then we can just get K over N is equal to S over delta times alpha over 1 minus alpha. So in our example, alpha is just equal to 1/2, so that becomes just 1 alpha over 1 minus alpha. But in most examples, it won't, right? So if alpha, say, is 1/3, then we'd have 1/3 over 2/3, and we would get 1/2, right? And so that would lead to a different golden rule level of savings and consumption per worker. So just take our example just as an example, right? Not as something that we think is an exactly right description of the production function between capital and output for an economy like the United States.